The Spin-off Podcast Network.
Would you wear the same shoes for every occasion? Or rock the same outfit 7 days a week? Of course not. Your style is better with options. Your investments could be too. Cboe Index options give you access to various contract sizes, global trading hours, and potential tax advantages. That's a good look for any portfolio. If you're ready to invest in style, head to betterwithoptions.com. There are risks associated with Cboe Company products. Review the disclosures and disclaimers at cboe.com/US_disclaimers.
Oh, it's such a clutch off-season pickup, Dave.
I was worried we'd bring back the same team.
I meant those blackout motorized shades.
Blinds.com made it crazy affordable to replace our old blinds.
Hard to install?
No, it's easy. I installed these and then got some for my mom. She talked to a design consultant for free and scheduled a professional measure and install.
Hall of Fame son.
They're the #1 online retailer of custom window coverings in the world.
Blinds.com is the GOAT.
Shop Blinds.com right now and get up to 45% off select styles. Rules and restrictions may apply.
When the Facts Change is brought to you by the Spin-off Podcast Network in partnership with KiwiBank, the bank for Kiwi looking to get ahead in business and in life. A bank that delivers expertise and banking know-how, smart advice for business owners wanting to invest, grow their business or diversify. A bank that adapts with technology through the lens of its people and customers. It is a bank with heart that is driven by its purpose. Kiwi, making Kiwi better off. It can be hard to know when the groupthink has changed. The groupthink in our political economy for the last 30 years or so really has been that open trade, low to no tariffs, free movement of goods and services and capital were a good thing across the board. And that as economies traded more and more with each other, as capital moved to the most efficient place, as workers and businesses were able to get on with their jobs and their lives without being directed by the state, that we would all be happier and healthier and wealthier. The idea was that the rising tide of economic growth would lift all boats. And this has underpinned a massive change in the global economy over the last 30 years, where, for example, China joined the World Trade Organization, and many countries unilaterally or often in various trade agreements cut their tariffs and saw much of their industrial base move to China. And consumers were able to buy lots of cheap stuff. That has now changed. The re-election of Donald Trump, if there was any doubt until now, has completely changed that paradigm, that groupthink, certainly overseas. Not so much here. Many politicians of both the left and the right still think that open and free trade is a naturally good thing and that we should continue to do it, and that the rising tide lifts all boats. And all you need to do is power up economic growth, and that will solve most of your problems. The trouble is, certainly for the last 15 years or so, in my view, since the global financial crisis, that groupthink has been challenged by what has actually happened on the ground, which is that most of the benefits of economic growth went to the richest 1%, and that the beneficiaries of open trade and free movements of capital and goods and services, the major number of beneficiaries were people coming out of very underdeveloped economies, the likes of China, other parts of Asia, where the bulk of the benefits went to people who've been lifted out of poverty and the people who are very, very rich. The people in the middle, if you like, or towards the richer end of the spectrum, actually didn't do very well, particularly men who didn't have degrees and who were working in factories. We've seen massive increases in inequality linked to falling life expectation, particularly for men in some developed countries. And a question has rippled through political economies in the likes of the United States and Britain and most of Europe, even in New Zealand. And the question is, does globalization actually work for most people? In this week's When the Facts Change, I talked to Max Rashbrooke, who is thinking about these issues at the Institute for Democratic and Economic Analysis. He's also a columnist with the Spin-Off and with the Post in Wellington. He studies inequality, wages, income, the welfare system in New Zealand, and has looked more closely at what's happened to inequality over the last 4 or 5 years, and has an interesting idea on how to reduce inequality through the KiwiSaver system. That's this week on When the Facts Change. Well, kia ora, and welcome to When the Facts Change to Max Rashbrooke. Max, great to see you.
Yeah, great to be with you, Bernard.
Max, you've been busy in a variety of with a variety of hats on. Firstly, I'm curious about the latest research on income disparities. All very topical at the moment. We've just had Donald Trump elected. Just in the last day or so, he has done the deed on trying to turn back the tide of globalization. You could argue that the globalization of the global economy in the last 30 years or so has generated a backlash democratically, and you could argue has helped to create problems around the capturing of existing democracies, and therefore it's worth looking at, exactly what's happening with inequality, because there's a lot of people who argue that, globalization's great. On the whole, the rising tide have lifted a large number of boats, hundreds of millions of boats, particularly poor people in some developing countries. But that elephant chart from
Branko Milanovic, I think.
Branko Milanovic, yes. That really tells the story of how, there's a bunch of people at the bottom end of the income spectrum globally who have done quite well out of increased trade. And then there's a whole bunch of people in the middle income groups of developed countries, particularly those involved in factory jobs who've perhaps lost their factory jobs, who have struggled. And we've seen some great research by the likes of Angus Dayton, for example, on the problems with a falling life expectancy, particularly for white men in America, and just goes to this massive story we have at the moment is, does globalization work, and is the modern sort of neoliberal economy actually reducing inequality? Could you tell us about the latest research that you found around inequality in Aotearoa?
Yeah, thanks, Bernard. And I think that is a really important backdrop, the one that you've just sketched out. So we recently highlighted a couple of pieces of research which tie into that story in slightly different ways. The first one was international research showing that when you look at histories of democratic backsliding, of democracies collapsing and falling into autocracy, falling prey to authoritarian strongmen, one of the single biggest warning signs that that's about to happen, one of the most obvious canaries in the coal mine, if you like, is a very high level of economic disparity. And that won't be totally surprising to a lot of your listeners, but it's one of those things that's really important to actually have that confirmed in the research. When you see countries with really, really big disparities between rich and poor, you have very large sections of the population who feel disaffected, who quite understandably feel resentful towards the elites, and then they are, of course, meat and drink to the authoritarian strongman who comes in and says, your plight is the fault of these media elites, these democratic elites, these judicial elites. Democracy has failed. Here I come to fix things up. And so that ties in very much to that story that you've just painted, that absolutely globalization in the last 40 years may have been good for people in aggregate. We may be better off because of it, but those gains have been very unevenly distributed. And of course, the big losers indeed have been, the people in the American Rust Belt, as a metaphor for the wider damage, those blue collar auto workers and people like that. And of course, those are the people who are turning towards Trump. The other bit of research that we highlighted was that in the New Zealand context, where we had the developed world's biggest increase in economic disparities between the mid-'80s and the early 2000s, we did between 2018 and 2022 see a reasonably significant decline in inequality, maybe sufficient to erase about a third of that huge rise in inequality under Rogernomics. And that was substantially because Jacinda Ardern and her government poured billions of dollars into the welfare system in ways that have often been unappreciated because people feel like COVID swamped everything or the cost of living swamped everything. But actually, Labour put something like $16 billion extra into the welfare system above and beyond business as usual course that John Key and Bill English had left them. And that's led to real increases in incomes for the poorest New Zealanders, even taking into account housing and the cost of living. What also added to that decrease in inequality probably was a period where stock market returns weren't that great, or the disruption with COVID and supply chains that temporarily and artificially sort of suppressed some of the incomes at the top. And unfortunately, we're seeing those trends, that sort of positive trend, that fall in inequality between 2018 and 2022 start to go into reverse. So inequality starting to rise again over the last couple of years because, of course, nationalism continuing those increases to benefits, and top 1% incomes are taking off again with the stock market having at least partially recovered. The positive news, though, obviously, is that policy can affect things. That's the main thing I take out. If a government really does put its mind to these things, it can actually change the picture.
When the Facts Change is brought to you in partnership with KiwiBank to help you understand the issues affecting the economy. And that's what their team of experts is here to do too. Here's KiwiBank's Chief Economist Jared Kerr with his prediction on what we can expect from the housing market and interest rates for 2024.
We've seen quite a correction in housing across the country. So house prices fell from the lofty levels that we saw in 2021. The Reserve Bank has pushed house prices down by design and by lifting interest rates to very eye-watering levels. I think the housing market has found a bottom, and I think we'll see house prices rising over 2024 and into 25-26. The housing market will be better balanced. We have seen a surge in migrants, which is adding demand to the housing market, and I think we'll see house prices naturally lift on the back of that surge in migration and hopefully an easing in interest rates later on.
Visit kiwibank.co.nz to stay up to date with detailed economic analysis and forecasts from Jared and other KiwiBank experts. They take big issues from both here and overseas and make them relevant to Kiwi businesses.
With new McValue at McDonald's, you always get more than you expect every day. So even if gas prices go up, you can buy a double cheeseburger and add a McChicken for $1. Or before game time, you can get $5 meal deals for the group. And if breakfast is about to end, get deals in the app to save before the bell. The choice is yours, and the choice with McValue is always more.
Prices and participation may vary. Valid for item of equal or lesser value. Must opt into rewards for app deals.
This episode is brought to you by Abercrombie. There's nothing better than the perfect jean and going out top combo, or an outfit that perfectly matches your plans. Abercrombie's relaxed jean goes with every occasion. Date nights with something lace, or daytime with a cozy sweater. And their barrel jean will surprise you. It's the trend that will become a staple in your wardrobe. Abercrombie denim comes in tons of rises, fits, and washes. Find your perfect pair online or in store.
Because one of the great complaints about globalization is that, yes, it seems to make everyone richer in total across the board, when you lump it all together. But of course, those people at the top end seem to get most of the benefits. And there hasn't been much of an effort to compensate the losers, if you like. There is a good argument to say that, having free trade is great. But you've got to make sure that you help out those people who have been the worst affected by it, those who have lost their jobs in the meatworks, or they've lost their jobs in the factories, and those people who, maybe have been forced to move from one factory town to a bigger city or whatever, which we didn't really see in the wake of the 1984 reforms. And you could argue that because New Zealand unilaterally dropped its tariffs faster than everyone else, that was one of the reasons for our rise in inequality being greater than everywhere else. We sort of did it more aggressively and earlier than everyone. And also the unwinding of parts of our welfare state in the early 90s helped increase the damage. And it's actually, since the late 90s, our inequality hasn't gotten too much worse. And as you say, it actually improved a bit. What sort of things could or should we have done to, soften the blow through that period?
Yeah, again, I think you raise a really valid point. I guess what's fascinating about the political economy of the world at the moment is we're seeing a couple of those big tenets of neoclassical economics challenged. The first one, obviously, we've already talked about, which is the idea that if something is good in aggregate, then that's the end of the story. And as we've just been discussing, well, no, you have to pay attention to the distribution of things. Robert Lucas, who was one of the sort of great macroeconomists of his generation, gave this now notorious speech, I think in 2003, where he said one of the most tendencies that is the most seductive, that's most poisonous to good economics is to focus on questions of distribution. And you think about where we are now, where one of the most famous economists in the world now is probably Thomas Piketty, whose work is almost solely about distributional issues. So that sort of neoclassical tenet has been very, very heavily challenged. The other one that's been challenged, but in a much more subterranean way, is this idea about the primacy of global trade and tariff-free trade. I mean, I think it's reasonable to argue, as you've said, that there are huge advantages to free movement of goods and services. But also, the history of a lot of countries of the last couple of hundred years is that they have got rich, at least initially, through protectionism. You'll know this, and some of your listeners will know this. The East Asia miracle of countries like Korea and Taiwan included, huge barriers to foreign competition, massive subsidies to domestic companies, governments in a very, high, heavy-handed manner saying to their big domestic companies, you are going to specialize in this or that. If you do well, we will reward you, we will subsidize you based on your export performance, and we will protect these industries until they're ready to flourish on the global stage. So, even that idea that just pure free trade is the ultimate, I think, has been challenged. Of course, the great irony now is that the huge challenge to it is coming from Trump in the worst possible way. And of course, what he's doing is the thing that the neoclassical economists were worried about, which is not doing tariffs and promoting certain industries because you've got a coherent plan about wanting to shift your economy onto a more competitive and productive track. He's doing it just out of pure nationalism and in order to harm countries he doesn't like. So you see why the neoclassical economists were worried about protectionism. They weren't necessarily wholly right, but some of their worst fears are coming true at the moment.
And you've got one idea to, help out those who are potential losers from this neoliberal thing, which is to ensure that the benefits of the profits from this globalization come back to individuals. As that's one of the arguments. If only everyone was a shareholder in this, property-owning democracy, we'd be fine. So, what's the idea of KiwiSaver for kids?
Yeah, so look, this is something that I think could solve a couple of really big problems that afflict us as a country. The first is obviously that a huge number of children, through no fault of their own, will hit adulthood, will hit 18 or 21 with no wealth behind them, no asset base, no foundation from which to build a brighter future. The other big problem we have is that we have very shallow domestic pools of capital. Very, very limited savings in this country. What a kid's KiwiSaver would do is it would enroll every child in KiwiSaver at birth, and then modest parental savings into those accounts, up to perhaps $200 a year, could be matched by the government. And for the very poorest families, the government could just put the money in itself directly. And so you'd have accounts that were growing by about $400 a year, and they'd be invested in some form or another. And if you assume just the normal returns of your average balanced KiwiSaver account that already exists for adults, a child could, when they hit age 21, have something like $21,000 in their account that would convert into a standard KiwiSaver account so they could use it for house deposit, retirement savings, and withdrawal in the case of medical emergency. And so you'd be potentially transforming the life chances of the very poorest children. You'd be putting the power of compounding interest in the service of the poorest families. You'd also be building, a domestic savings pool ultimately worth billions of dollars. And you could then either, as you say, just assume that effectively what's happening is that all those children are benefiting from the growth of the world economy. As you say, they're participants, they're shareholders, they're stakeholders in that economy. You could also use those kids' KiwiSaver funds for something more like nation-building purposes, along the lines of a sovereign wealth fund or a citizens' wealth fund, some people have suggested. That comes with some complexities about where you're investing the money and do you run the risk of lower returns if you're trying to do it for nation-building. That's a conversation we could have. I just think there's something potentially really exciting there that could, as I said, solve a couple of really big problems that we face as a country.
And that's exactly the sort of idea that you're producing with the Institute for Democratic and Economic Analysis. Max Rashbrooke, who's also a columnist for The Post and also writes for The Spin-Off. We'll let you have a rest. Thank you very much, and thanks for coming on to the show.
Thank you.
When the Facts Change was brought to you by the Spin-Off Podcast Network, together with KiwiBank. Visit kiwibank.co.nz to find out how KiwiBank are making Kiwi better off.
The Spin-Off Podcast Network.